All right, welcome back to another video. Today I'd like to do a response to the debate video that I saw between Dr. William Lane Craig and Dr. Richard Carrier. The title of this video is Did Jesus Raise from the Dead? It was conducted at Northwestern University, I believe. And starting right off the bat, so let's start with Dr. Craig and what he believes and the way that he approaches it. He starts off and he has the presupposition that God exists, and so basically that's how all the things that are listed in the resurrection narrative in the Gospels about Jesus' resurrection, that's how those things are possible, because, anything's possible with God. So he starts with the fact that, and he believes that the account that we have is a historical record. He starts off also by saying that there's two ways that we could approach the gospel stories about Jesus' resurrection and the empty tomb. He says we can approach it as looking at it as a historical, looking at it from a historical perspective. Do we have a historical record? What's the historical accounts in the Gospels, and looking at them as if they were true. And he says also we could approach it from existentialism. Now, he also went further to say that he acknowledges that people generally don't come to Christ or don't come to a belief in Christianity based upon a historical record. So he opts for saying that, okay, existentialism, that's how people come through. So they don't, it's about some type of personal experience that they have, rather than it actually being based on historical fact. Well, that's very telling, but that's how he's approaching it. And that's all well and fine if that's what he wants to believe. But I believe that the historical record, historical facts, should outweigh any kind of other approaches that we apply to whether or not we believe that this is an actual event that took place. Now, Dr. Craig has four main contentions, and these are the things that he believes, why he believes that the gospel accounts, why he believes that Jesus was buried and was crucified, buried, and resurrected on the third day. He talks about Jesus' burial, and that specifically what he goes into that, and he talks about with Jesus' burial, he's saying, well, because it talks about Joseph of Arimathea, actually was a Jew, and he supposedly had a tomb that he buried Jesus in, and so again, I guess because there's a story about it that makes it true. And again, he also goes on to say that because a number of other New Testament scholars believe that the Bible's account of Jesus's resurrection story, the Easter Sunday morning story, that they all believe it's true, so therefore it means it's true. Even though there's a large number of skeptics, there's a large number of secular scholars who've raised questions about the validity and whether or not we have any kind of historical record, whether there is any real truth to it or not. That it's debated. So again, I don't believe in a consensus of New Testament scholars saying that, oh yeah, this is generally widely held that this is true and yada yada yada. Craig also believes that the discovery of the empty tombs is a telling sign. And what he means by that, he talks about that, Jesus was crucified, and then he was placed in this tomb, supposedly by Joseph of Arimathea, and then, the disciples don't go back and find the empty tomb. It's the women that go back, according to the books of, I think it's in Mark and Matthew, that tell the story of the women going back to the empty tomb. Let me pause right there before I go on a little bit further. Part of one of the issues that really calls into question whether this is a historical document for me is the fact that when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John's account of the resurrection narrative, they're not, okay, you could say overall it's consistent. A man was crucified, buried in the tomb, but the stories are not 100% in detail identical. Now, again, no four people could tell the same story the same way, but the general gist of it's there, so one would say, okay, it must be true. But there's some kind of key points that you'd think that, okay, did the women run to the tomb? Did the women not run to the tomb? You could go in and read each account for yourself and see how they vary, but there's some kind of key important details that, to me, aren't corroborated between the other four, among the four supposed independent gospel accounts. and of course that's what Craig believes, is that we have 4, independent sources, that as if like, it wasn't the early Christians writing their own propaganda. It sort of, he sort of seems to be, I don't either, naively, blatantly ignoring that. I'm not sure, but anyway, so back to the discovery of the empty tomb. He believes it's true because the account that we read in the Gospels, it talks about how, so the women discovered it and they went back and they told the disciples and they didn't believe, and then I guess Peter went back and then he found out, in fact the tomb was empty, and it's just like, and so because apparently women's testimony was not widely held or believed, it was not creditable, supposedly, according to Dr. Craig. That was popular in Jewish customs and laws, that, women's testimony wouldn't be relied on. So they think, because of the fact that there's an embarrassment, that it's women that discover the empty tomb, and that it's the women that tell the story, that right there is a smoking gun to tell you that this must be true. Well, until you find out from Dr. Carrier later in the debate that, in fact, that's not. There was no such prohibition on women's testimony. And in fact, many other times their testimony was acknowledged, and there was certain things that they could attest to and that they could give testimony of. So you're left going, okay, well, who's telling the truth? I don't know. I'm not a Jewish law scholar. I guess you'd have to ask a rabbi, because they'd be the subject matter expert on the issue. Okay, so that's why he's saying, because of the discovery of the empty tomb, because the story says that the tomb was empty, and that apparently even the Jews that were persecuting Jesus admitted, according to Dr. Craig, it says, the body's gone, and so the disciples, they must have stolen the body away. He says that's a smoking gun, that because, there was no body, and that the early, critics of Christianity were saying, admitting that the body was gone, so it must have gone somewhere. So that means that even they were saying that, the body was apparently empty, so they had an empty tomb. So that means there was a tomb at some point in the first century that was empty, that was supposed to have the body of Jesus, that now doesn't. So does that conclusively mean, he rose, went to heaven, and he's with his Father in heaven now, and that's the only explanation? I mean, I suppose, if he was in a tomb, and the body was missing, then you have to ask the question, where did the body? That's in fact if the story is even true, and it's not just a myth or a legend. But again, we don't even get to that point. He's approaching it from like the accounts that we have are historical evidence. It's an actual eyewitness account, and it's not, because the Gospels that we have, their stories are not the great detail that we have about Jesus' resurrection that day is not written about until the early 70 CE, Common Era. So why is that? And then we have the early writings of Paul, whose his writings were the closest, and Paul's writings and his epistles are void of the great length of detail that was given on Jesus' life and his resurrection and his death. And why is that? That's pretty suspect and pretty telling to me when I think about it. But anyways, apparently not to these, New Testament scholars. But, so because the tomb was, found empty, that must mean it's true. Because women discovered it and were the ones to tell the story, that was an embarrassment, so that must mean that, it must be true, because women told in their testimonies can't be relied on. That's his position, that's his argument. His fourth point is talking about the origins of the disciples' belief. In other words, why the heck would Paul be writing about this? Why were these unknown authors of the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the book of Acts, why would they be writing these things if they didn't have some sort of experience, some sort of supernatural experience? If Jesus didn't appear to them after his death and his resurrection and walk amongst them, if that wasn't a hallucination, as Dr. Carrier asserts, that it was probably likely that it was a hallucination, because he doesn't see these things happening in the natural world, but in this one instance we're supposed to believe it was true. So, I mean, I don't know. You have to ask, why were they writing this stuff? And is the only conclusion that the reason that they were writing about this stuff was because these were events that actually took place, that Jesus actually appeared to Paul, that Jesus actually appeared to the other Simon and Peter? I mean, is that the only explanation? So it's like, I don't think so. I mean, if you think about it, when Dr. Carrier talks in the debate, if you listen to it, he explains that when you look at the New Testament Gospels, it doesn't read as a historical document would read. it reads as like a myth and a legend would read. It has telltale signs that are not consistent with what you would consider to be a historical document. So you'll have to watch the video to hear more about that. But so what is the origins of the disciples' belief? Why did they believe this stuff? Why did they choose to take up their cross and start Christianity? Why was Paul a Roman who once persecuted Jews and Christians, and now all of a sudden, Paul, he had some kind of conversion? I don't know. People have all kinds of transformations, but that doesn't mean that what they believe in really happened. Doesn't really mean what they believe in is true and is an actual event or is an actual thing that you should follow till your death. No. Okay, so he says that the burial account is multiply attested. Well, when he says that, by multiple being attested, he's talking about the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So it's written about 4 different times. That's like if me and you and 3 of our other friends, or 2 of our friends, if I can add correctly, write a story about the same thing, and we say that this is what happens, that means, that it happened. I don't think so. Not necessarily. I guess, there's people way more knowledgeable than I am in the scholarly realm that already obviously sifted this information. But he says we have 5 independent accounts: the 4 Gospels and Paul's writings that account for the existence of Jesus, his death, his resurrection. Even though the resurrection in Paul talks about is more of a spiritual rebirth, not so much a physical rebirth. And that's why is it? If Paul is our closest writing to the time of Jesus' death, why wouldn't we have the great detail of, hey, Jesus appeared to me and he was here and we hung out and we had a couple of brews. It's not like that. You don't get that kind of reading from Paul. So what was the other point he had? because the story says so, that makes it true, basically, is his position. Because Jesus' tomb was empty, it means it happens. He feels that, because there was an empty tomb, that absolutely means it occurred. Talk about the embarrassment clause, the testimony of the women not being trusted. Therefore, this means it must be a true event, he concludes. Dr. Craig also says that the best explanation of these stories is that they, in fact, occurred. If that was the case, then there would be no naysayers, there would be no skeptics, and you say, well, there's always going to be people that don't agree. Yeah, but the people that are skeptics and the people that are, looking at this saying, hey, you know what, this doesn't really hold up. They're not coming out of this, approaching it out of a place of, just lunacy, because they're crazy lunatics. They have compelling arguments. And so, let's see, what's the one more thing before I get to Dr. Carrier's points that he made? So he says that they could have occurred, and all right, so I already read all that to you. Story, okay, so now Dr. Carrier, so we look at his points. And there's an appeal to Josephus, who was a historian, who mentions, but nowhere in the detail, that the the 4 Gospels talk about Jesus' resurrection. Josephus, I don't know to what extent, but it's not anywhere near the level of detail that we get like the Gospels. So what is Dr. Carrier, the skeptic, the atheist, what's his position? Well, basically try to sum it up. His idea is that the whole thing is a story that's made up, that it has the telltale signs of a legend. It has, the telltale signs of a myth. And I understand that, Dr. Craig criticizes Dr. Carrier about this and saying that his beliefs are not widely held and it's kind of on the fringe, and he's, kind of way out there. He talks about it being very fanciful, that, even though Dr. Carrier would like to believe this stuff, very few people believe it. So what does that mean? Because he's a minority, that means that what he is putting out there can't be true? And I think he does an excellent job of laying out the points, and it's very plausible what Dr. Carrier is proposing. So he says that Paul lacks the details of the gospel, and Paul is supposed to have come before them. So why is that? And I mentioned that earlier in talking about this. And what is this? Craig admits that Paul's writings are void. Okay, and even Dr. Craig himself admits that Paul's writings are void of the detail that we get. So, he concedes to that and acknowledges it. So, what is Dr. Carey's position? Well, he believes that the gospel record is not a historical record. They're myths. He talks about the Barabbas myth, how, we can talk about that real quick. that basically the story goes that Jesus and this man Barabbas was this criminal who had done a bunch of heinous stuff and rebelled against the Romans. And supposedly there was this, according to Dr. Craig, there was this custom that they would, and it's in the Gospels as well, that they were given the choice to release Jesus, or they were given the choice to release Barabbas, a known criminal. Now, Jesus hadn't really done anything. He was just out there preaching heresy. I mean, he really hadn't broken any Roman laws. I mean, he wasn't a real bad guy by any means. I mean, compared to this other, guy Barabbas. And so in the end, they I think it was Pontius Pilate is the one that says, well, what do you want me to do? And the Jewish crowd, the Jewish mob, says, hey, yeah, crucify and crucify. So, it's like, well, why is that? Why is it this guy who was supposed to be the savior is now being executed and being crucified when he really wasn't that bad of a guy compared to this Barabbas guy? And so the thing that Dr. Carrier is talking about is he's saying that there was no such custom in the Roman law to release any prisoner, and certainly not a prisoner that was as heinous as this Barabbas guy was and had done all the horrendous things that were way more egregious in Roman eyes than what Jesus had done. So it's stuff like that you're like, oh, okay, interesting. So there's no such record of the Romans having any law where they did this, and so you have to look at the historical record. Well, what does the record show? Well, it doesn't support that assertion that Christians make that they had a choice between Barabbas and Jesus. So let me bring it all to a close and say that basically what I thought of the debate was I had a hard time with Dr. Craig. I'd seen him debate Dr. Robert M. Price before, and he sort of had the same kind of, I don't want to say he was condescending, but and I don't want to say he mocked them, and because there was the decorum, it was a professional debate, and everything, but it just seemed like he was smug. It's like he seemed like he presented his, he seemed very much like a theologian, and he's from that camp, so that makes perfect sense. But what did I think of the debate overall? I mean, it's worth checking out if you're interested in that sort of thing, and and I found it to be very compelling, the things that Dr. Carrier was saying, and I felt that he held his own against Dr. Craig. It just seems like Dr. Craig will not let go of his apologetics. He's just going through and through. He's just going to stick to it. And I don't think there's anything that you could present to that man that would get him to, And I think he was asked one time, I think Dr. Carrier mentioned this in the debate, that I think Dr. Craig was asked one time, is there anything that would cause you to not believe, or is there, if anyone could present any information to you that would, cause you to question what you believe? And he's like, well, no, Dr. Craig says, no, I wouldn't believe that. I believe that someone was trying to trick me. And it's like, wow, man. It's basically you're telling right there that you won't give up the ghost no matter what. No matter what anybody tries to present to you, you're not going to believe it. So he believes that, we have the Bible, the New Testament Gospels are an account of a historical record of the resurrection of Jesus. I'm more in the camp of Dr. Carrier and feel that he's right. I think that there are myths. And when you start getting into looking at the similarities between those and other dying and rising gods from around that time period as well, how the Jesus story is very similar. You can get a lot of that information from Dr. Robert Price as well. He's done a lot of research into that and finding the comparisons. And I think the idea that Jesus was as a historical figure begins to sort of melt away and sort of fall into that same category as all these other dying and rising gods, when a lot of the same elements of the story are there. So yeah, I didn't really care too much for the arguments that Dr. Craig presented. I'd seen him before with like I said, with Dr. Price, and both. I'll post that that debate as well. But overall, I mean, it was it was interesting to watch, and I like to hear both men present their arguments, and they were done tastefully, they were done respectfully, so they respected the decorum, they respected the debate process. What I didn't like was the fact that you get a little soundbite here, then they try to respond back. The next person has a few minutes to respond back, and it's almost like you wish you could do like a "what say you," and then you run over and put the mic and get a quick response, but you can't conduct a debate like that. It's too chaotic. So I have respect for the process and how they have to do things, but it was frustrating because you wish you could just kind of say, okay, Dr. Craig made a good point. What's your response to that? What's your rebuttal? Quick 2-minute rebuttal. And and some debates are set up that way, and that's great. But this one wasn't bad. I'm grateful that they did it, and so I hope that you found this video to be stimulating, at least intellectually, somewhat. Get your mind thinking about these ideas, about these concepts. I mean, I know it's about he said, she said. Dr. Craig versus Dr. Carrier, both well respected within their fields, both educated, and certainly men that know what they're talking about. And so you're left to sift the facts and try to figure out and try to make sense of all this. Do we really have a historical record of the account of the resurrection of Jesus? Is this event that really took place or not? And I don't know if we'll ever really know for sure, but I think you got to kind of let the facts weigh out and let that be your guide, and hopefully you'll come to the right conclusion, and it'll make sense to you. So, all right, thanks for watching the video. We'll see you next time.